On the night of March 9, 1945, the United States Air Force killed roughly 100,000 civilians in a single air raid. The entire operation lasted 6 hours. That is more people than died in the immediate aftermath of Hiroshima. More than Nagasaki. It remains the deadliest air attack in the history of human warfare. But here is what should bother you. If you grew up in America, you have probably never heard of it. This is the story of Operation Meeting House, the deadliest night in human history, and the 80-year conspiracy of silence that followed. But before we get to that night in Tokyo, we need to go somewhere unexpected. We need to go to the Utah desert, where the United States government built an entire Japanese neighborhood for the sole purpose of learning how to burn it down. In 1943, 85 miles southwest of Salt Lake City, construction crews broke ground on one of the strangest military projects of the Second World War. The authorization came directly from President Franklin Roosevelt in a meeting held in his bedroom, alongside Standard Oil executives and Air Force generals. The project was code-named the German-Japanese Village at Dugway Proving Ground. What they built still defies belief. 24 Japanese-style residential buildings, designed to replicate the working-class neighborhoods of Tokyo's Asakusa district with obsessive precision. The architect was a Czech-American named Antonin Raymond, who had practiced architecture in Japan for nearly 2 decades. He knew Japanese residential construction intimately. He had designed Standard Oil's offices in Yokohama, and now he was being asked to design buildings that would teach America how to incinerate Japanese homes. He later wrote in his autobiography that he was not proud of the work. But the level of detail went far beyond architecture. Because authentic Japanese building materials were impossible to obtain during wartime, the planners improvised. Russian spruce, confiscated from a Siberian shipment, substituted for Japanese cedar. Mountain Douglas fir replaced Hinoki cypress. Rattan stood in for bamboo. Approximately 80 truckloads of tatami mats were shipped from Hawaii. Where real tatami could not be found, replicas were woven from Mexican agave fiber. To compensate for Utah's dry climate, the buildings were moistened with steam radiators to simulate Japan's humidity. Every variable that might affect how the structures burned, including wood density, aging, and moisture content, was meticulously documented. Between May and July of 1943, these structures were bombed at least 27 times and rebuilt 3 to 4 times. The goal was simple: find the weapon that would burn Japanese cities most efficiently. The winner was the M69 napalm bomb. It was a 6-pound steel pipe filled with jellied gasoline. In tests, it produced uncontrollable fires in 68% of Japanese-style wooden buildings within minutes. By the end of the war, 30 million of these bombs had been manufactured. The structures they were designed to destroy housed millions of Japanese civilians. Now, the official story you will sometimes hear is that Tokyo's civilian deaths were unfortunate collateral damage from strikes on military and industrial targets. Declassified documents tell a completely different story. The most important analysis of these records comes from historian Thomas Searle's 2002 paper published in the Journal of Military History. Drawing on long classified files from the Air Force Historical Research Agency, Searle concluded that Japanese civilian casualties were not accidental or incidental. They were an explicit goal of the incendiary raids. As early as 1943, United States Army Air Forces planners estimated that incendiary attacks on Japan's 6 largest cities could kill over 500,000 people, render nearly 8 million homeless, and force 3.5 million evacuations. These were not after-the-fact discoveries. They were pre-campaign projections, accepted as the cost of the strategy. A Joint Chiefs of Staff report on Japanese target systems listed expected results, including the dislocation of labor by casualty. That phrase sounds bureaucratic until you realize what it actually means. killing workers. The designated target for the Tokyo raid was a 3 by 4 mile rectangle in the Shitamachi district. This area was home to somewhere between 750,000 and 1.1 million people, packed at a density of 103,000 per square mile, one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. The area was 87% residential. Before the raid, the Office of Strategic Services had produced fire vulnerability maps ranking Tokyo's neighborhoods by how easily they would burn. They used pre-war risk assessments from Japanese insurance companies to identify the most flammable districts. The previous commander of bombing operations in the Pacific, Brigadier General Haywood Hansel, had been relieved of duty in January 1945. His replacement was Curtis LeMay. Hansel's crime was that he considered area bombing of civilians basically repugnant to American mores. LeMay had no such hesitations. When LeMay made the decision to launch Operation Meeting House, he deliberately sent notification to his superiors on March 8th, a day he knew General Arnold and Chief of Staff Norstad would be absent from headquarters. He later admitted he wanted to protect Arnold from blame had the attack been a failure. Now, let's talk about what actually happened that night. At 5:30 p.m. on March 9th, the first B-29 superfortresses lifted off from Guam. LeMay had ordered a radical tactical change. Every defensive gun except the tail turret was stripped from the bombers. All ammunition was removed. Most gunners were left behind. This freed up 3,000 additional pounds per aircraft for incendiary bombs. His own intelligence officers predicted that 70% of the bombers could be destroyed. LeMay was gambling with the lives of his crews on an untested strategy. The actual loss rate was 5%, 14 aircraft out of 334. The first Pathfinder planes arrived over Tokyo just after midnight on March 10th. Within minutes, they had laid down incendiaries in a massive flaming X across the Shitamachi district, marking the kill zone for the bombers that followed. Within 14 minutes, Tokyo firefighters conceded defeat. Within an hour, the individual fires had merged into something far worse, a self-sustaining firestorm. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey later described what happened as a catastrophe in which probably more persons lost their lives by fire in a 6-hour period than at any time in the history of man. Temperatures inside the firestorm reached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Some reports suggest localized hotspots exceeded 2,800 degrees, hot enough to melt concrete and liquefy asphalt. The conflagration generated its own weather system. Hurricane-force winds exceeding 65 miles per hour created cyclonic activity that sucked oxygen from the surrounding atmosphere and drove walls of flame through streets at running speed. People died in at least 5 distinct ways that night. Some burned alive as their clothes spontaneously ignited from radiant heat without ever being touched by flame. Some suffocated as the fire consumed all available oxygen. Thousands drowned after jumping into the Sumida River and canals, only to be boiled alive or asphyxiated by flames rolling across the water's surface. Others were trampled in the chaos as crowds converged on bridges. Some died from molten glass as superheated windows liquefied and rained down, embedding in scalps and skin. The survivor accounts carry a specificity that statistics cannot convey. Haruyo Nihei was 8 years old that night. She later recalled fleeing her family's underground shelter when her father realized they would be cooked alive if they stayed. In her words, there was a strong wind that night, and as she came out of the shelter, all she could see around them was fire. Burning clothing, tatami mats and debris were blowing down the road, and it looked like a flowing river of fire. She saw a baby on fire on its mother's back. She saw children burning, but still running. She lost consciousness and was later found by her father beneath a pile of corpses. The charred bodies of strangers had inadvertently shielded her from the flames. Katsumoto Saotome was 12 years old. He would become Japan's leading chronicler of the Tokyo air raids and later founded the only museum dedicated to this event. He wrote that not many of those who jumped into rivers or canals survived. Flames and scorching blasts of air blew over them from both banks. Large numbers perished even before the flames could get to them, dying of asphyxiation as the fires sucked the oxygen out of the air. The bridges over the Sumida River became killing grounds. At Kotatoi Bridge, a full B-29 bomb load landed directly on a crowd of fleeing civilians, incinerating hundreds instantly. At Kikukawa Bridge, as many as 2,000 people perished on the span and in the canal below. Bodies were still being recovered a week later. One survivor named Kyuka spent the entire night standing in the Sumida River, repeatedly pouring water over her head to keep her hair from catching fire. Above the inferno, B-29 crews experienced their own kind of horror. The firestorm's updrafts tossed 60-ton bombers with altitude changes of 1,000 feet. Some aircraft were flipped completely inverted. The fires were visible 150 miles away on the return flight to the Marianas. But the detail that haunts me most is this. Crews flying at 5,000 to 9,000 feet could smell burning human flesh through their aircraft. One gunner recalled that you could smell, I'm sorry to say, burning flesh in the airplane. First Lieutenant Bill Lind, after landing, yelled to his ground crew, "Hey boys, come over to this aircraft and smell Tokyo." Curtis LeMay himself later acknowledged what happened that night with characteristic bluntness. He said, "We scorched and boiled and baked to death more people in Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, than went up in vapor at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Take a moment to let that settle." The man who ordered the attack said it out loud. And still, almost nobody knows the number of people who actually died. The death toll from Operation Meeting House remains genuinely unknowable. Estimates range from approximately 80,000 to over 200,000. The commonly cited figure of roughly 100,000 represents a reasonable midpoint, but it carries substantial uncertainty. Even official Japanese sources disagree. The Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department recorded 83,793 dead and 40,918 wounded. The Tokyo Fire Department estimated 97,000 killed and 125,000 injured. Confirmed bodies recovered numbered 79,466. But here is where it gets complicated. Between 1948 and 1951, the ashes of 105,400 victims were interred at Yoko Amicho Park, already exceeding the police figure. As of March 2020, only 81,273 names had been added to the memorial list. Why the gap? Because inclusion requires a surviving family member to submit an application. When entire families were incinerated, no one remained to report them missing. The factors preventing an accurate count are structural and irreversible. The firestorm's temperatures cremated bodies beyond identification or recovery. Municipal records, ward offices, and population registries were themselves consumed by fire. The Shitamachi district housed large numbers of unregistered migrant workers and day laborers who existed in no official database. Historian Mark Selden has argued the true figure may be several times 100,000. Historian Edwin Hoyt proposed 200,000 in 1987. Both governments had institutional reasons to minimize the count. The Japanese wartime government suppressed casualty reporting to maintain civilian morale. The post-war Japanese government faced potential compensation obligations. The American military focused damage assessments on physical infrastructure rather than human casualties. The truth is buried in ashes that were never counted. But here is the thing that makes this story different from other wartime tragedies. The forgetting was not accidental. It was a project. So here is the question that should bother you. Why does almost nobody know about this? The immediate death toll from Tokyo exceeded both atomic bombings. More people died in one night of conventional bombing than from either nuclear weapon. And yet, Hiroshima is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Hiroshima is in every history textbook. Hiroshima is burned into global consciousness. Tokyo is a footnote. The explanation has multiple layers, and all of them are deliberate. The first layer is what scholars call nuclear exceptionalism. Nuclear weapons threaten species-level extinction. They became the defining reality of the Cold War. They spawned an entire disarmament movement. The existential dread of nuclear annihilation commands attention that conventional weapons, however devastating, do not. But that only explains why Hiroshima is remembered. It does not explain why Tokyo was actively suppressed. That requires understanding the occupation. When American forces occupied Japan from 1945 to 1952, the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers instituted comprehensive censorship. 31 categories of content were banned from Japanese media, including any criticism of the United States. And critically, any mention that censorship itself existed was also forbidden. The Civil Censorship Detachment monitored 200 million letters, 136 million telegrams, and 800,000 telephone calls. Close-up images of bombing victims were prohibited. Survivor accounts were suppressed during the precise years when collective memory forms. By the time censorship ended in 1952, the atomic bombings had already captured the world's moral imagination. Tokyo never had a chance to be remembered. Then came the Cold War. Japan's transformation from defeated enemy to indispensable American ally created mutual interests in historical silence. Japan needed American protection. America needed Japanese bases. Neither government wanted to relitigate the moral catastrophe of the firebombing. The culminating symbol of this arrangement came on December 7, 1964, the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. On that day, the Japanese government awarded Curtis LeMay the First Class Grand Cordon of the Order of the Rising Sun for his contributions to Japan's Air Self-Defense Force. The man who orchestrated the burning of Tokyo received Japan's highest honor. National protests were virtually non-existent. Japan's own institutional dynamics reinforced the erasure. The Japanese government actually preferred the atomic bomb narrative. It implied helplessness against overwhelming technology, deflecting attention from the government's decision to continue fighting through 6 months of devastating conventional bombardment after March 1945. Civilian firebombing survivors were explicitly excluded from post-war compensation. The Japanese government has spent the equivalent of $405 billion on military veterans and atomic bomb survivors. For the estimated 1 million people left homeless by the Tokyo raids, 0. When 112 survivors filed a class action lawsuit in 2007, the Tokyo District Court dismissed it. The ruling stated that citizens were supposed to endure suffering in emergencies like war. Supposed to endure. As of today, no state-built memorial to the Tokyo firebombing exists. A planned Tokyo Peace Museum was canceled by the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly in 1999. The only dedicated museum, the Center of the Tokyo Raids and War Damage in Koto Ward, was privately funded by over 4,000 individual donors after its founding by survivor Katsumoto Sayotome in 2002. Sayotome spent his entire adult life trying to get his country to remember what happened to him when he was 12 years old. He died in 2022 at age 90. His daughter Ai is now digitalizing his archive. For 80 years, it seemed like the silence would hold forever. But something is finally changing. The past 5 years have seen the most significant wave of attention to Operation Meeting House since 1945. Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Bomber Mafia, brought mainstream attention to the firebombing debate in 2021, though historians criticized it for centering American officers while giving civilian deaths only a few sentences. James M. Scott's book, Black Snow, published in 2022, offered a more comprehensive account. Scott argues that the path to Hiroshima and Nagasaki began with the firebombing of Tokyo. Once mass civilian death was normalized through conventional bombing, the atomic bomb provoked little additional moral debate. Scott quotes LeMay's chilling admission, "If we lose the war, we'll be tried as war criminals." The documentary Paper City, directed by Adrian Francis in 2021, followed 3 elderly survivors in their decades-long fight for recognition. All 3 subjects have since died. The 80th anniversary, in March 2025, generated significant international coverage. Survivors like 94-year-old Shizuyo Takeuchi and 97-year-old Reiko Muto spoke to AP and NBC News. One survivor, Yumi Yoshida, made a statement that I can't stop thinking about. She said, "This year will be our last chance." A 2020 proposal by Japanese lawmakers for a one-time payment of roughly $3,380 to survivors remains stalled due to ruling party opposition. The survivors are dying. The witnesses are disappearing. And still, no compensation. Still, no memorial. Still, no acknowledgement from the nation that did this. The Tokyo firebombing matters not merely as a historical event, but as a moral threshold. It was the moment the United States institutionalized the deliberate mass killing of civilians as acceptable military strategy. The planning documents, tested at Dugway and implemented by LeMay, established a template that would run through Korea, through Vietnam, and beyond. As Mark Selden wrote, "Every U.S. president from Roosevelt to George W. Bush has endorsed in practice an approach to warfare that targets entire populations for annihilation." The firebombing of Tokyo didn't just kill 100,000 people. It established the precedent that made every atrocity after it possible. The forgetting was not passive, it was engineered. Through wartime racial dehumanization, through 7 years of occupation censorship that banned even the acknowledgement of censorship, through Cold War alliance politics that gave both governments reasons for silence, through nuclear exceptionalism that redirected the world's moral attention to Hiroshima. What distinguishes the Tokyo firebombing from the atomic bombings is not the scale of suffering, it's the completeness of the erasure. The last survivors are dying. The privately funded museum in Koto Ward operates 4.5 hours a day, 5 days a week. No government on Earth has compensated the victims or their descendants. The deadliest single night of aerial warfare in human history remains, for most Americans, something they have never heard of. Until now. If this story moved you, if you think history like this deserves to be remembered, hit subscribe. I'm going to keep telling the stories that got buried, the ones they hoped we'd never find. Because the people who survived that night spent their entire lives trying to make sure we'd remember. The least we can do is listen.